Jose Cueto, and my position is President and CEO of International Finance Bank. I think it varies, and I think that's what makes it interesting. I arrive early and I leave late. That's probably the constant, and it can vary, but lots of meetings, lots of communication, certainly in today's environment, a ton of email, but my philosophy is about people, so I tend to spend a lot of time during the course of the day either on the phone with my team or directly engaging them in person. My uncle was a president of a bank. He was the president of Bank of Miami, Justo Legido, and I looked up to him quite a bit, and I was interested in banking. Did I think it would be my career, and was it love at first sight? Probably not. I think it was a job, and the more I learned about banking, the more I enjoyed it, and as such, I stayed in it, and I learned to really love a lot of different facets of banking, and that's really what drove me to it. I think in the end, it was really about the interaction with people that I love about banking. I started as a summer intern at Republic National Bank. From there, I became a teller, a part-time teller. Then I became a full-time teller. And let's see, that was in the late 80s, early 90s, you're asking. My memory isn't all that great. But from there, I stayed with Republic National Bank for a couple of years, eventually going into customer service and more back office type of functions. From there, I went to work at Flagler Federal. This is all while I was still in school. Flagler Federal was acquired by First Union. I hung out with First Union for a little bit of time, and then I had an opportunity to go work as an operations teller type supervisor with Capital Bank, which is a Miami-grown bank that's not around anymore. I stayed there for a couple years. I worked on Brickell Avenue. There I had an opportunity to go work for a Brazilian bank, Banco Real, and it was the first bank I had worked at that was more international in flavor. So that exposed me to a different type of bank. It was a bank based out of Brazil, so we dealt with a lot of Brazilian clientele. I stayed there for probably 4 or 5 years, if I recall correctly, and I went through several different positions, ascending through the ranks. And then I had an opportunity to go work for Bank Leumi as a head of operations and head of back office, and managing a lot of different functions. I stayed there for about 5 years. I progressed through the organization, eventually, leaving there as a young vice president. At that point, I was identified by Caja Madrid, which was a European bank based in Spain, looking to open an office here in the United States, and they needed somebody to head up that project. I thought it was an interesting project. I took that project and initially came on, in a back office CFO role and as the deputy general manager of that agency. I stayed there 12 years. So this brought me to 2012. I started in that role. Eventually, I went into a role as a lender. I then assumed capital markets as well as lending, and I was part of a team that was responsible for the acquisition of City National Bank, and which subsequently led me to sit on City National Bank's board for several years. During the end of my tenure there was when the crisis began, not only in the United States but also in Europe. Caja Madrid decided that they were going to divest of non-strategic assets. So that definition included anything that was outside of Spain. So at that point, I moved on to head of corporate banking for First Bank Puerto Rico. I stayed there for approximately 2.5 years in that role. I was a senior vice president and head of corporate banking. And that's when International Finance Bank came knocking. That was in, I think our conversations probably started in 2014, although, I didn't accept an offer and go through the process until almost the middle of 2015, which is when I started. And, that's where I am today. I think it starts with creating the culture. One of the first things I did was, it's oftentimes not a pretty thing, but a necessary thing, and that was a ground-up reorganization. of the bank. I think you know, you surround yourself with the right personnel. You bring in, you know, lenders and bankers that understand the market that we're operating in. You create, you know, policies and strategies that are effective, and I believe that, you know, those lead to growth, you know, in the right environment. And I think, you know, we've also benefited from a very strong market, and that certainly doesn't help, that doesn't hurt our ability to grow. But I think, you know, it's the creation of a culture and really, you know, driving what that culture should be. And I think that if you do that, you know, I think that growth certainly follows if you're doing things the right way. It was intentional. I think that if you're dependent on foreign capital inflows into the United States, then you're putting yourself in a position that you're dependent on certain events that you can't control. Balancing an international strategy with a domestic strategy allows us to really control our growth here locally. So, you know, certainly there's a diversification part, but there's also, you know, the ability to really control the way you grow in a manner that's certainly more granular and within the grasp of your control. You know, subsequent to the Modern Bank acquisition, I would tell you that we've now shifted back into more of a, call it a 60-40 split between international and domestic, since the primary component of the acquisition was international clientele. Although some of them have now become U.S. citizens, we still focus on considering it to be international clientele. So I think, you know, I think that we will go back to that as our strategy will be to continue to grow both internationally and domestically. But if you inject $150 million of deposits, it's going to have a little bit of a shift in the balance, and certainly, you know, that's exactly what's happened. So we're a little bit more domestic, a little bit more international today than we were, you know, maybe 6 months ago.